Okay, so welcome back to CC5, which is basically the course companion on perfect competition in perfectly competitive markets and monopoly. And if you remember last time round, we were looking at different types of objective for firms and also showing the way in which you might show that with an illustration of sorts. Now we're going to move on and take a look at moving from page 16 in your CC5a booklet. Page 16, other objectives of firms. So we're looking at a couple more in addition to the ones that we've looked at previously. And then we're going to move on and look at specifically perfect competition and the way that things happen in a perfectly competitive scenario. First things first, then let's take a look at this first objective, which is something. It's an economic principle known as allocative efficiency. Okay, and fundamentally, we are being allocatively efficient where basically our selling price is equal to our marginal cost. Now, if you think about that as a principle, what you are doing is allocating your resources in the most efficient way, in one sense, in that you're meeting your costs for producing each item, each extra item, your marginal cost. But the price that you are receiving for that is essentially equal to the marginal cost. So one could argue that as a business, you're not making any profit. And if you were an accountant, you wouldn't particularly be encouraging that. But from an economic standpoint, being allocatively efficient is where you're effectively providing the most efficient use of the resource, but also providing the most the maximum amount of utility for the customer too, or the consumer too. Okay, and it's almost the point at which we're at break even, if you like. We're not actually making a profit as such, but in some cases, governments might seek to ensure firms operate at that point, at that allocatively efficient point. Okay, and in some cases, particularly if the government is imposing this objective on firms through state ownership and some degree or some sort of regulation, what they're suggesting is that in this case, and we can show it by an illustrative example here. So we're quoting, or we've got a diagram which is labelled revenue and costs against quantity, and you can see in this instance where we're talking about our marginal cost line and our price being the same. Effectively, that is the point of being allocatively efficient. Okay, so we'll look at that in a bit more detail, and we'll keep coming back to it. But particularly when we start looking at perfect competition, but that's fundamentally what allocative efficiency is. So it's the point at which the price that we're selling at, is equal to the marginal cost of producing that product or service. Okay, so that's one of the other examples. Now, within your booklet on page 16, you can actually have a go at drawing that graph in, and also you can check out the Powell textbook, which will also give you examples of how you draw an allocatively efficient diagram to show that objective being allocatively efficient. Okay, we'll keep productive efficiency and allocative efficiency is something we'll keep coming back to, particularly when we start looking at perfect competition, as you'll see shortly. Okay, so if we then look at comparing objectives of firms, then get a little activity for you to do, and try drawing in this case, the profit maximisation, revenue maximisation, sales maximisation, and allocative efficiency. Okay, so in the same way as you've shown that on page 15 in your booklet, just have a go at replicating that, and just you don't have to do it all on one diagram. You can, but the more that you can practice this principle and be able to show the difference between profit maximisation, revenue maximisation, sales or output maximisation, and allocative efficiency, it gives you the time that you'll spend getting to grips with this and getting familiar with it will be well well worth the hassle. I believe me, it'd be well worth it. So let's move on then and take a look at long run profit maximization then. Okay, so in essence, if we're talking about objectives that obviously make sense for businesses, then long run profit maximization seems to make an awful lot of sense, doesn't it? Because if we can do that, if we can consistently produce at our lowest average cost, and sell at the highest price, the highest selling price, we are going to be achieving profit maximization. But a short run objective may be to of increased market power. That would lead to higher profits over time. So if you think about making sure that you have higher levels of market share, and you've got an increased share of voice, for want of a better term, that over time is going to lead to higher profits, because you can justify that. You can become a price maker as opposed to a price taker, and you could also argue that if you were truly in the short run were truly profit maximizing, you would be constantly adjusting your price in response to changes in demand. And in that case, clearly, if you really had your finger on the pulse in terms of the market that you were working within, you might be able to do that. But in lots of instances, some firms will prefer to keep stable prices. And they might use something called a cost plus pricing system, which effectively is looking at what your costs are. So the cost of producing your in the long run your goods or service, and then adding on top of that a profit margin to make sure that you are getting the profit margin that you agree. It wouldn't necessarily mean that you are profit maximizing, but at least you would then be happy with the return and the margin that you're achieving for that particular good or service. Okay. So let's take a look at some of the other issues that we might need to consider in the longer run then. Okay, so we've talked about long run profit maximization, and how we might do that by looking at specifically at issues around some of the things that might happen in the short run. Okay, but the other thing to also bear in mind, we have got a number of other objectives that businesses might have, okay, and structures that businesses might have. One being social enterprises. Well, basically, a social enterprise is an organisation that is set up not really for profit. It's more to actually maximise human or environmental well-being in some shape or form, and it's not about maximising profits. Now, clearly, social enterprises still need to make a profit, in terms of being able to then decide what they're going to do. They can't be constantly running at a loss, because clearly that's going to mean that they're not sustainable in the long run. But there are a number of examples, and Jamie Oliver's 15 restaurant is quite a good one. There are a lot of social enterprises that are around and about, and they basically are giving something back. So they may be making some sort of profit, or certainly covering all their costs, and then using any profits that they make to improve other things, and not just line shareholders' pockets. Okay, so there's a couple of examples there you can go and take a look at. There are a whole raft of others, and there are lots of, I suspect you might know one or two in the local area, some of the social enterprises that have sustainable development or environmental protection as the thing that is really driving their activity, and what they will do to actually support those sorts of things, rather than just making money. Okay, so we're going to move on and take a look now at perfect competition. So we're on page 17 in your book, and you'll see that perfect competition is a fairly big and fairly chunky area. We're going to cover, I think, probably not all of this in this one session, because there are a number of examples that we'll need to look at, which involve illustration and diagrammatic representation. But certainly being able to understand and show that you understand perfect competition and what it's trying to demonstrate to us, and for us, is going to be an important thing. Okay, so this is 4.1.5.3, and the content that you're going to need to know includes the following. Okay, so being able to diagrammatically analyze a perfectly competitive model in both the short and the long run is something that you will need to be able to do, and we'll go through that step by step. And it's something that we might want to come back to when we're back to face-to-face teaching, but we'll certainly talk about that in a bit more detail as we get closer to that glorious day. Some also got to think about the implications of the following for the behaviour of firms and the industry. So large numbers of producers, identical products, freedom of entry and exit, and perfect knowledge, which are some of the implications or some of the things that a perfectly competitive market will have to exhibit, and what the implications of that might be. Certainly some appreciation of why firms operate in perfectly competitive markets are price takers. Why are they? We've already talked about that and touched on that, but we'll come back to look at that in a bit more detail. And the proposition that given certain assumptions relating, for example, to a lack of externalities, perfect competition will result in an efficient allocation of resources. Okay, so when we're talking about truly efficient allocation of resources, that's where we have both productive and allocative efficiency. Now, that's something that you're not going to be familiar with yet, but we will touch on that and go into it in quite a bit more detail and hopefully demonstrate that diagrammatically too. Clearly, we've talked about the fact that firms have a variety of possible objectives, and we've already touched on that to a point. But certainly when it comes to being perfectly competitive, we need to be able to demonstrate that in a perfectly competitive situation too. So what do you need to be able to demonstrate then? You need to be able to show an awareness of perfect competition in both product and labour markets, and how you can use that as a yardstick to judge the extent to which real world markets perform efficiently or inefficiently. And to some degree, if we talk about the ideal allocation of resources, if we have some sort of misallocation of resources, then clearly we are going to be struggling a wee bit in terms of demonstrating that we're achieving that. Now, we've said before that because of some of the implications of perfect competition, that it's very difficult to justify perfect competition in the real world. However, and the point made in that first point about what students should be aware of is that you can use it as a yardstick to say, well, in an ideal world, if all these other things were equal, we should try to achieve both productive and allocative efficiency. That would be the best allocation of resources. And clearly what we can do then is look at that as the perfect scenario, if you like, and then compare some of the real world situations to that as well. Also need to think about and be able to critically assess the proposition of perfectly competitive markets and the fact that they do lead to an efficient allocation of resources. So in some cases, clearly, by demonstrating that in some cases some of the assumptions of perfect competition are a little questionable, then effectively being able to evaluate and assess that critically is clearly an important principle too. Okay, so let's have a look at the 6 characteristics or conditions of a perfect competition. Okay, so there are 6. I think we have touched on these before, but we'll go through them again. And they are as follows. So the first scenario of a perfectly competitive market is that you've got many buyers and sellers in the market, okay, but none of them are big enough, large enough, or have a sufficient market share to be able to influence price. So many buyers and many sellers in the market. That's the first condition of a perfectly competitive market. The second one is that all buyers and sellers have perfect information, perfect knowledge, know exactly what's going on in the market, what prices are, what the cost of production are, and they have access to exactly the same technologies that all other buyers and sellers have. Consumers can choose to buy as much as they wish, and they can purchase that they wish to purchase, and firms will sell as much as they wish to supply at the ruling market price that's set in the market as a whole. Okay, so fundamentally, any consumers can buy as much as they want at a fixed price, or a price that they know they're going to pay, and firms can sell as much as they wish to supply. Okay, so again, in the real world, would that happen? Probably not, but it's one of the characteristics or conditions of a perfectly competitive market. Next one is freedom of entry and exit to and from the market. Okay, so effectively, in the industry that we're talking about, or any of the industries that are in a perfectly competitive scenario, there are very low barriers to entry and exit. So that will mean that businesses will not have to have significant investment in order to enter a market, and they won't have any reasons to move out of the market due to cost or any other issues. So freedom of entry and exit to and from the industry as another condition of perfect competition. All firms will produce homogeneous products. That means that they are the same. Basically, they are uniform. They're all identical. Again, a bit of an odd one in that is that really ever going to happen in a market, in a real world market? However, for a perfectly competitive market, that would be the case. So we're all producing exactly the same product. There are no transport costs to be considered either. But again, without wishing to question the whole principle of it, clearly there would be transport costs in real world markets. However, for a perfectly competitive market, we assume no transport costs. How realistic are those assumptions? Well, I think maybe you get a flavour for what I feel about it. But again, this is a model. It's a theoretical model that you do need to understand and do need to appreciate, and to be able to demonstrate and illustrate, and also then maybe question some of the assumptions that we have to consider when talking about perfect competition. Okay, so let's move on and take a look at some homogeneous products then. So let's see if we can come up with a few. Standardized or homogeneous products. Here are some that you can take a look at. Okay, each one of these you could argue is an homogeneous product, a cement type of cement. So generally speaking, cement is pretty much the same. One could argue there are different types of grades of cement, but fundamentally they are a fairly standard product. Wheat is a fairly standard product. Okay, almost homogeneous. So anybody that's supplying wheat is supplying pretty much the same thing. Sporting bets, potatoes, fruits in a big street market, bars in Spanish resorts. Those could all be argued to be very similar standardized products. Okay, so there are some examples that you could consider. Okay. If we take a look then at the next thing, which is talking about short-run profit maximisation in perfect competition, we need to then consider a number of things here, and I'm just going to move myself again to demonstrate this point. Okay, so we're talking about a number of things that we need to bear in mind, and also if we take a look on page 18 in your booklet, there are some notes that you might like to also consider. Okay, so we've looked at some markets that come close to the conditions of perfect competition. So we've got foreign exchange markets as an example, and agricultural markets. This is on page 18 in your booklet. And there are some implications too that we need to bear in mind. Okay, so firms are always going to be price takers. That means that firms are small. They all sell the same product. They must therefore accept the going market rate, and that to some degree is then going to influence both supply and demand within an industry. Okay. Remember though, as we said before, firms are able to sell as much as they wish at the ruling market price, and so the average revenue or demand curve is basically the same as the marginal revenue line effectively. So because the price is basically going to be the same, then obviously that rule applies. Okay, and remember our profit maximizing rule is basically where we will keep performing and keep producing for as long as we get to the point, until we get to the point where marginal revenue, the amount of revenue that you receive for producing one extra item, is the same as the marginal cost of that item. Okay, so effectively in that situation, we would actually be trying to produce as much profit as we could from the scenario that we found ourselves in. Okay, now when we're talking about showing short-run profit maximization, we're going to, in a perfectly competitive market, we need to, in some cases, be able to demonstrate both the way in which you might see that in an individual firm, but also how that might happen in an overall market. Okay, and clearly some of the things that we talked about, some of the assumptions that we talked about in that last few minutes of the presentation are important to bear in mind. Okay, so what we've got to think about here is that marginal revenue and marginal cost are equal. Okay, so let's take a look at how this all plays out then. And again, if you want to take a look on page 19 in your booklet, there's quite a nice example there of how we can demonstrate a firm's profit maximizing output and where that occurs, particularly, and remember, this is in a perfectly competitive market. So let's just draw in our axes and label our axes, and we can see that in this case, for our firm, we're talking at cost and revenue and against output, but where we're talking about the overall market, we're actually we're plotting price against quantity. Okay, so let's just take a look at how this may play out when we draw in these graphs then. So the first thing we're going to do is to look at our demand curve for the market, and that is a downward sloping, as we know, for the fact that basically as price falls, demand increases. We then got our supply curve, which basically is upward sloping, and again, as price increases, more people are likely to supply at that point. Okay, so we've got an equilibrium point now, but we've also got a point at which, because we're talking about perfect competition, perfectly competitive, we've got our price at equilibrium, okay, which obviously is the point at which, in a perfectly competitive market, that would be our price. The quantity at equilibrium is QE, as we can see there. And if we then think about how that translates to the firm as opposed to the market, we've got a situation where effectively our marginal revenue and our average revenue and our demand curve are all equal, because remember, in perfectly competitive market, we are price takers, we're not price makers. We have to abide by the market rule that fundamentally we are in a situation where we're being told what we can sell all of our products for. So effectively, we've got a horizontal line there in a perfectly competitive market where marginal revenue equals average revenue equals demand. So if we then draw in our marginal cost curve for the firm, okay, so remember initially we're going to have marginal cost at a certain point. That's then going to fall as some of our fixed costs are actually spread over a larger amount of output, and then we're going to start to get an increase in marginal cost as we produce more. Now, clearly, at this point where we've got a scenario where our marginal cost equals our marginal revenue, that is the point at which if we were profit maximizing, that's the point at which we would be operating. Let's just draw in that point then, okay? So in this instance then, we've got our quantity, sorry, that should actually be profit. So the PM should stand, it should actually, PM should be up by the P. So the quantity of profit maximization fundamentally is at that point there. Okay, so our price is pretty much a given, but our quantity at profit maximization is the point at which we will keep producing until the point at which we have our marginal cost equaling our marginal revenue. If you think about it, for as long as our marginal cost is lower than our marginal revenue, then clearly we are going to carry, if we're profit maximizing, we will keep carrying on up until the point at which our marginal revenue and our marginal cost is equal. Because for all the time that we're even just a fraction below our marginal revenue, as far as our marginal cost line is concerned, the difference between, let's say, performing at this point and this point here is essentially still profit. Okay, so you can see in this scenario, we don't know at this stage whether we're making a profit or a loss. Okay, but we do know in this scenario that actually, if we are in the short run, our profit maximization in perfect competition will be at a point, at some point, or definitely at the point at which marginal cost equals marginal revenue. Okay, so okay. So if we then take a look at demand and revenue curves then, and I think I'm going to stop there. I think I'm just going to, we've been going for about just over half an hour or so, and I think it's a time for you to just have a look at some of the textbook, make sure that you understand some of the principles of how we've gone about this, and then we'll move on and look at the next section, moving on from short run profit maximization in perfect competition. Okay, so thank you for watching, and I'll catch up soon.